Hello, and welcome to the Women's Work podcast. This podcast is a research podcast dedicated to showcasing, discussing, and celebrating all of the achievements, accomplishments of women around the world. A little bit about me. My name is Asia Minor, a filmmaker here in Atlanta, Georgia. And essentially, just to provide a little bit of a background of how this podcast came to be. I was visiting the Jimmy Carter Center for the first time this year in 2025. And in the introductory video, as I was sitting down and making myself comfortable, there was a brief talk in a brief section about Rosalynn Carter's, not only her accomplishments to the White House when she was First Lady, but also her taking a trip to Latin America. And as I'm sitting and I'm listening to her delve all into the work that went into making that trip, as well as discussing just a lot of the work as a whole of being First Lady to Jimmy Carter, some of the different boards that she sat on, X, Y, and Z. It really, I was floored that I had no idea that First Lady Rosalynn Carter had accomplished all of these things. But then the wheels in my head started spinning, and I went, I'm thinking, how many other women are out here that have made all of these incredible accomplishments in our history, and they have either been overshadowed by their male counterparts, or just did not receive the recognition that I believe they deserve. And so sitting there, by God, this idea popped into my head. What about starting a research project highlighting some of these accomplishments? And as I am an Atlanta girl, born and raised, I wanted to kick off this podcast by highlighting 3 incredible women, all surrounded around the theme of civil rights. 3 incredible Atlanta women, I should say. So for this kickoff episode, we're starting with First Lady Rosalynn Carter, Coretta Scott King, and we're finalizing with Elizabeth McDuffie, who was a housekeeper here in Atlanta, Georgia, but who became so much more. And I'm so excited to have you all here along with me. I've been working with a talented team of researchers. And so just to set a little bit of context, each of the women mentioned in this podcast, right? So Rosalynn, Coretta, and Elizabeth McDuffie. These are essentially women who are operating in essentially when America was in the fractured time of mid-60s to 70s. Each and every single one of these women are being born in an era that's past slavery, right? You have segregation happening. You have the Great Depression, prohibitions, women's rights or lack thereof. And so what we're going to be discussing about with these women, and kind of as we go about and talk through this podcast, and I invite multiple guests to come on here and discuss these women with me, right, are how each of them use their agency and how each of them use their autonomy to use their position, so to speak, to really impact and make change. It's how they rose above their stations in life to equal the playing field, using their voice, and again, in very much a time when women were not, facing discrimination and sexism within their own personal lives, personal statuses, and really how they all sort of overcame that, right, to give us the positives and the benefits behind what we all are able to take advantage of today. So that's some of what you can expect to hear as I talk and discuss about each and every single one of these women. I'm super incredibly excited for you all to hear just some of the commonalities, some of the themes. And so with that being said, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the Women's Work Civil Rights Series. Rosalynn Carter, who's a young girl from Plains, Georgia, will go on to be one of the most powerful voices for equal rights, advocating for mental health and the rights for women's voices to be heard, even as she faced sexism and discrimination from the highest office in the land. Not to be cast aside as dutiful or placid, Rosalynn Carter would set the precedent for the definition of what a First Lady could and should be. By the time First Lady Rosalynn Carter left office, she was the first woman to carry a briefcase to the White House. She spearheaded the Mental Health Systems Act of 1980 and made a historic envoy trip to Latin America to promote democracy. Rosalynn Carter accomplished this and more. But before her start as First Lady, and definitely before becoming President Jimmy Carter's wife, Rosalynn was born on August 18th in 1927 in Plains, Georgia. Her parents were farmers, but after her father's passing, her mother entered the workforce, the crux of the movement of women moving away from being housewives and essentially entering into the workforce. And one can say that Rosalynn, right, is gaining and viewing the importance of a lot of dedication and hard work. So she attends a local junior college. While there, she serves as vice president of her class. She became a founding member of the Young Democrats Club, and she was a campus marshal. Go Rosalynn. Then Rosalynn would go on to see a picture of Jimmy Carter. As the story goes, she liked him. He fell in love with her. The two were married, and the rest was history. And so now we're talking about Rosalynn as the First Lady of Georgia. So it's been said that Rosalynn would essentially become the best asset for Jimmy on the campaign trail. She showed how incredibly adaptable she was to certain environments. Rosalynn was an incredibly amicable person. People flocked to her. I would dare to say partially because they knew that if you're having a conversation with Rosalynn Carter, she's hearing you, she's seeing you, she herself is understanding the struggle, or at least is able to identify with the struggle. And essentially, you knew if you were talking to Rosalynn, it was going to get to Jimmy and something was going to be done about it. But essentially, Rosalynn is heavy on the campaign trail. And so while Rosalynn is out there campaigning, one can infer that she's seeing sort of mental health and the lack of resources, right, that are available to those. And so this is probably what kind of sparked her desire to spearhead true mental health change and policy.
And so that's, I guess that what we're kind of trying to do is kind of set up what it looked like, or like what the position looked like when Rosalynn Carter comes into, um, we're saying that, but of course, when they say small peanut farmer, it was not a small farm. They ran an agricultural like empire. Him and Rosalynn did. He took over for his father, who died in 1953 ish. But that image of him being like a rural um, Georgia peanut farmer is what really got him his presidency in a way.
Yeah.
He seemed a lot more trustworthy, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Especially because you have the Kennedy assassination. Then you have everything that happens with Nixon, Watergate. We're also kind of operating under the Vietnam War. So you're right. So just essentially a lot of turmoil, a lot of public distrust, and absolutely a lot of people have credited that appearance of Jimmy and the Carters being the small peanut farmer as trustworthy, right? It was wholesome. It was kind of like this is a way for us to rebuild government trust and it also sets up Rosalynn, who, is really where I think her agency really comes into play. Because I'm pretty sure too, now Jimmy was a senator, correct?
Yes, he was a senator first.
He was a senator first.
Yeah, he was a Georgia senator first.
Okay, he was a Georgia senator first. And then I know
Mm-hmm.
that it mentions, so Rosalynn was incredibly useful there, in terms
Mm-hmm.
of campaigning for him then. But then I also think you and I
Mm-hmm.
both read in an article that when she found out that they were moving back to Plains, like just how
Mm-hmm.
absolutely
Yeah.
devastated, you know.
She was upset. She was a Navy officer's wife who lived a pretty like good life, especially like since he was traveling all over the country, um, living in metropolitan cities. Um, and so to go back to Plains, Georgia after that, I feel like I'd be upset too. Like after living a bit of the high life, you know. Uh, but it wasn't all bad because that's what really got him um, into his presidential seats and moved them into the senator's mansion in Georgia first before he becomes like the Democratic, I think, elect that eventually won the uh, the presidency in
Mhm.
1976. I know like they go by 4 years, but
Yeah,
sometimes
but
I'm like I have
it's
to do the math in my head. I'm like, huh? Which
right.
which year? Yeah.
Well,
But
and
then they
it's
don't technically start until like January the next
the
year.
next
So
year.
yeah.
Well, and it's
Yeah.
also, I know where, well, so even when they went though to go back and run the family business, like Rosalynn was a
Hmm.
big part of, I mean, like huge, like she
Yes. Yeah.
served an incredible role in the family business. But then when we comes to campaigning and senator and definitely him campaigning for the presidency, you know, it's famous that like Jimmy always viewed Rosalynn as like his secret weapon. I mean, it's been attested to
Hmm.
without her putting literally her boots to the ground, like there would be no President Jimmy
Hmm.
Carter. But I know we want to talk about her mental health policy, and I was reading that
Yes.
essentially, or her impact on mental health policies. It was all of that campaigning that she was doing, where she was seeing how true mental health and the resources or lack thereof, I think is really what kind of lit that fire for her of like, this has got like, this is the American epidemic, is the mental health
Yeah.
crisis, which if you kind of, you could possibly, and I'm sure scientists or other researchers have linked that back to what we were just saying, suffering through a war, a president impeachment, you know what I mean? But just the fallout of mental health, because that's kind of what I was wondering.
Oh
Is I
yeah.
was like, like where did that passion for her come from?
I think I mean, she was very an astute lady from her background too. She was raised as a quintessential like Southern lady, right? She was the
Mm-hmm.
youngest in her family, but she did go to college as well, so she was well educated. So I'm sure, I mean, she wasn't blind either. She could see what was happening in the country. And I think you're right. With the years of war, that's like 2 decades. I would say its
It's
afterlives are still like, it's still very much around. And as an
absolutely,
Asian girl, I can tell you that, yeah. um,
yeah,
I can
yeah,
confirm that, yes.
yeah.
Um, and so I think Rosalind did see that in the American people. And so, of course, um, she starts her mental health task force. Um,
Mhm,
which
mhm.
is very progressive of her, I would say. Because even
Absolutely.
now, a lot of like people, especially like I don't know, I grew up an immigrant kid. My parents have always told me that mental illness doesn't exist. Um,
Oh
so
yeah.
and people like that do exist, right? They still do
Right.
exist, like, even amongst American people.
Right.
Um, so it was a very progressive thing for her to her work in that and
Hmm.
start kind of contributing to that with her influence.
Yeah. Well, and let's one of the instances, that one of the articles that we have talks about is one of the people she met on the campaign trail was a woman who was working the night shift, and then had to go home and take care of her daughter with mental illness. And so just the complete wear and tear of that. And then you have to imagine too, like she's probably going and she's campaigning in a lot of remote places and a lot of remote spaces as
Yes.
presidential
Yes.
candidates do. So she's seeing the entire gambit of just the
Mm-hmm.
havoc that not having, proper access to
Mm-hmm.
mental health policy and resources can
Mm-hmm.
do, yeah, to a family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if you even just look at the words, right? Mental health, it is health. And so thinking about that, people don't, especially if they don't live in America, they don't understand how far away you are when you live in a rural area, especially if you're like low income, um, don't have many resources, all of your family don't have very high education like rates, right? Or like
Mm-hmm.
the people around you either. Um, like people don't really put everything into perspective into how difficult it is to care for yourself mentally. And that could be something as little as fatigue all the way to like dementia, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Right.
how far the spectrum can get. But it's an important part of human health. And if you can't even get like a proper medical care within like 20 miles of your house, like
Right.
what makes you think you're gonna get like, proper mental care?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
well, right. And so like one of the first things that she did is she went through a lot of like educating against the negative stigma.
Stigma influences the way people perceive things,
Yep.
which that includes people who make policies and make things
Yes.
happen. And so, it's an important thing to combat that stigma.
It is, and like I mean, we can talk about, right. So like we can see it in the sense of, so she's increasing the public awareness there. She's doing everything she can to like combat the negative connotations with it. That is part of what I think allows her to start creating better systems like of and getting those
Hmm.
resources to those families. So combating that, making sure that these families are able to take care of or at least have access to these resources, like you said, like if you're having to drive, you know what I mean, 20 miles, making
Yeah.
in-home programs. But one of the also major things she did was testifying and lobbying for actual like legislation, right? So and
Yes.
Rosalynn shares this in common with both Coretta and Lizzie. They, each of these women, put their
Hmm.
money where their mouth was. So it wasn't just all
Yeah.
talk. And I think that's a big ode and testament to Rosalynn Carter's time as first lady as a whole, was really about her
Hmm.
action and making sure that stuff happened. But yeah,
Yeah.
like getting the Mental Health Systems Act of 1980 and the Addiction Equity Act of 2008, getting all of that
Hmm.
legislation.
But I mean, this sounds right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you have all of that legislations that's passing, and then of
Hmm.
course, right, like her work at the Carter Center, literally having a mental health task force. I mean, like this. I mean, like we're
Yes.
saying it, and just saying it, Christy, like sounds like a really big freaking deal. Like these were really
Hmm.
huge undertakings. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't think kids nowadays understand like how hard it is to push policy, you know? Um, I hate to keep bringing back that article from Dr. Perry, but like it really brought some insight to me. She mentions that the American people were often wary whenever um, the first ladies do start getting involved in politics, because they are unelected, right? They were not the ones that were chosen to lead the country, and in a way, some first ladies did run the country out.
Well, and that's not even to state, yeah, like as we move into her time in Latin America, which talk about like
Hmm.
talk about unprecedented, but just some of
Yes.
the in line with what we're talking about, like literally the
Hmm.
sexism, right? And the
Hmm.
just
Yes.
extreme pushback. Because so like another article that is on millercenter.org, was essentially writing about, so, President Carter wanting to appoint Rosalynn to certain things. I think wanting to give her like sort of these official titles because of exactly what you stated, and not being able to do so. And he wanted to appoint her as chairperson, on like essentially this mental health committee, and he couldn't do it. And so she became honorary chair, but still just not letting that stop her. So she still attended meetings. Rosalynn still went about touring mental health facilities, and just worked as hard as she could, right? Like really did all of that groundwork and foundation, to turn the tide of mental health as a whole. And so I think all of that work that she did, in culmination with being on the campaign trail and running the family business, is what sets her up for immense success in Latin America. And this is like one of the, I think one of the most exciting portions of this podcast. Like I'm like really excited to talk about. And Christy, just to kind of piggyback off of you, so you were making some really good points. And I think would you mind just providing a little bit of context of what she was up against, right?
Yes. So, because of course we went over her position as First Lady and how that wasn't really considered like an official position. But of course, Rosalynn did not take that very, very well and kind of tried to spin it into her own thing. In her biography, or is it autobiography when they write it themselves? I think it's autobiography.
Yes.
Yeah, in her autobiography, First Lady from the Plains, I think it's what it's called. There's a whole chapter. I think chapter 7 goes out over her emotions and how her thoughts about being the Latin America. She very much prepared for this position, right? It was repeated over and over again, from articles to her own autobiography, that she wanted to be taken seriously. She takes language lessons 3 days out of the week, to learn Spanish, to be able to communicate with the leaders of these countries, right? Which, in my opinion, shows a lot of respect. It's hard to learn a language, but she wanted to be able to understand fully what was going on. So she takes language lessons, and then she takes diplomatic lessons with the White House officials. But even then, there was a lot of skepticism surrounding her future, before she even goes on her 13-day tour of Latin American and Caribbean countries.
Right, which in itself, Christy, is wow, think about that. 13 days across
13 days
across
12,000 miles.
Yes. Several countries, each with their own. I mean, I think that's the thing that really inspires me about this, because each of the places that she's traveling have their own, I don't know, just own makeup. Right. But I think that is part of what really set Rosalynn up for success in this, was she saw the humanness in it all, and she treated each one kind of on their own terms. She treated each one with the respect. And Rosalynn really took the time, like you said, learning Spanish 3 days a week, making sure that she was up to date as much as possible on what was going on, taking this with the utmost sincerity. But I think treating each one like its own container and trying to understand.
Yeah, and not only that, she read a lot of what was going on, the situations that were going on there, official documents, from official documents to newspapers to literature of each of these countries, which is such a feat, such a feat. And
right.
And of course, she only did this within the span of a couple of months. Yeah, and so there was a lot of skepticism. People in the White House, like men in the White House, officials. And the American people did not think she was going to produce any results like Lady Bird Johnson did.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like, just went home with, like, I don't know, the Latin American people having a slightly worse image of America. Um,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
people were scared. People were scared that her debut in politics wasn't going to be taken seriously. But she understood what was going on. She knew she was going to be traveling to regions dominated by male culture at the time, right? And so seeing her as like a little southern lady, like a little southern um, lady from the plains, right? They didn't think that she was going to be able to comment on like topics such as like nuclear proliferation, commodity prices, arms sales, trade,
Mm-hmm.
third
Mm-hmm.
world development problems, and of course human
Yep.
rights. Like, she surprised them. She used her
Yeah.
goodwill and her knowledge of policy to, win acclaim for being pleasant and commanding, for for issues concerning uh the area that she's in, and for individual like nations where they're just like, yeah, nobody believed in her, blah blah blah. It was successful, but they kept mentioning like, oh, like the male foreign policy, like um officer from the State Department is going to go after her. Like, oh, he's like another foreign policy official from the State Department is going to go after that person. Like, two male foreign policy like
Yeah.
officers from the State Department were going to go after her, as if they were trying to say like, in case she messed up, we're going to clean it up. And I'm
Oh
just
my
like, so
gosh.
even
Are you
after she came
serious?
back, yeah, I'm serious. So even after she came back, and it was a very successful trip, most of the leaders praised her for her conduct and her knowledge, and that's a thing that was like not very common amongst first ladies. And even then, okay, like they still were like, oh, but like, who knows? It's like saying like, oh, she probably just got lucky, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Basically, in a
yeah.
nutshell. Oh my gosh.
So again, dismissing her ability to combine like expectations of her gender, but also to be taken seriously as a person who is knowledgeable in these policies, right?
It's still one of the more successful of what like has been used against them is the very same thing that they use um, to set them up for success. I mean, like you said, to get people to listen
Mm-hmm.
to them, to kind of
Yeah.
get their way. So all that about having manners and how to, sit and speak and all the
Mm-hmm.
things that's placed upon you as a woman being like a secret
Yeah.
weapon, so to speak, which is so we kind of keep coming back to, right? Is like, what is women's work
Mm-hmm.
and how does
Mm-hmm.
it function? And like all these definitions that are upon us as women and what it is that we're supposed to do. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of how each of these women, subsequently, the women that will be discussed, kind of really use that to their advantage to take their own agency because
Yeah.
as a whole, every single thing that we've talked about with Rosalynn, up until this point, and I know kind of like the last thing that we'll kind of like touch base on is her in the ERA, right? Because you have the Equal Rights Act, so you
Mm-hmm.
just have a lot of
Mm-hmm.
stuff happening with women and women's right and
Yes.
the appearance change of women
Yeah.
that's happening during this
Yeah.
time. But
Yeah.
yeah,
So this,
it's
and
yeah.
I think it is important to say that these women that we're talking about, yeah.
Right, which is huge. I mean, and it's a big part of what she and Jimmy prided their presidency on, right? Was that this was going to be a human rights, like it was a human focused
Mm-hmm.
presidency first, but to see it in action, yeah, like she wasn't playing around. She was like this, like I so kind of like so with that, and one of the last like major things, right, that like you can't not talk about Rosalind is Rosalynn and the ERA. Coretta also did a crap ton of work, of course, for like women's rights and equal rights in her speeches. But considering like this is Rosalynn had like federal government change, right? And then like Jimmy kind of comes into play with everything about like the equal rights kind of like amendment. Essentially, there was like a lot of discourse around it. And so Rosalynn really like taking the mantle and getting behind this amendment, and then how it kind of all like results is really nothing short of incredible. So just to kind of like give just a little bit of context. So the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, is a direct descendant of the 19th Amendment, which guarantees women the same rights and privileges as men. And this was the amendment that was written by Alice Paul in 1923. And so when I say like there was a lot of discourse around it, essentially like it was to ratify. So there had been a lot of sort of like fights to ratify the ERA for years, like all of like the sort of major historical points that we've been talking about in America's history, like everything that we've been discussing. You have this going on like right at the heart of it. So truly, Christy, basically, in my mind, from like the 1920s until literally now, where we're talking about with Jimmy's presidency in late 70s, early 80s, America was just like life was lifing, and life was lifing hard. But so you kind of have all that going on. Of course, all of like the tireless work that's happening with the 19th Amendment, 1920, kind of like what we're talking about. And like, so you have the suffragist movement that's going on. And you have essentially like, this is the crux, the heart of the fight for women to be seen as equal, have equals right, equal voices. Of course, we can't mention, like we cannot not mention us being women of color, that our fight and the fight for women of color looked vastly different, still does.
Yes.
But nonetheless, women's voices fighting hard to be heard. This is all happening here. Yes. And so essentially where Rosalynn kind of comes into play is, so the fate of the amendment essentially was in trouble after the 7-year deadline that was placed on the ratification process by Congress. So essentially when all this is coming to an end, you have the fate of the amendment in jeopardy. In 1973, the amendment saw 8 ratifications. In 1974, it had 3. And in 1975, it only saw 1. In 1976, right? So you called out the year before. This is Carter's, the start of his presidency. No states ratified the amendment. And so this is where President Jimmy and Rosalynn kind of comes into play. So
only for the right to vote. There were still several laws surrounding and like limiting women to what they could do without a husband. The picture of life around that time was very different than how it is now. I think someone mentioned to me like it wasn't until like 1970s or 1980s when like a woman could even open her own bank account without a man. Like something as simple as that, right? Or like medically, like if you don't want any more children, like to tie your own tubes. To this day, I think doctors like still need, like some doctors still like are adamant on consulting your husband,
picking it up. And so when Rosalynn was first lady, she spoke at the opening reception of the National Women's Conference in Houston, Texas on November 1977. And joining Mrs. Carter were quite a few of our other lady women's work friends, right? So shouting out Coretta Scott King, yes, she was there. Then you also have previous first ladies, Betty Ford and Lady Bird Johnson. And then you have a couple, like several other activists and suffragists.
Betty Friedman,
Barbara
Sorry,
Jordan.
Betty Friedan. Yeah.
Betty Friedan.
Okay.
Liz Carpenter, Gene Stapleton,
Mhm.
and the Maya Angelou. All of that culminates, essentially all that talk, that tireless effort culminates in October 20th, 1978. President Jimmy Carter signs the extension of the Equal Rights Amendment. And that's, that's definitely like an overview, listeners. Like, we kind of like speed run through that. But
Yeah.
it's just to give the highlights of Rosalynn, like, just literally did not stop. You know what I mean? And now you got to imagine all of this too was happening before their plans for the Carter Center, which is something else entirely. Rosalynn's, that being a huge undertaking on her own. Her and Jimmy building the Carter Center, and really a lot of the policies and changes that she took there, which is like a part 2 episode. Really, everybody deserves a part 2 episode, Christy. It's nuts. I mean, there's no
We could talk
way
forever about these women.
about these.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, but I think, I don't know, like you said too, Christy, like just to think all of this, these women, and it just puts you in the seat of everything that we're still fighting today, but just kind of like thinking to what we can look back to, in the past, really, of like just the fight for the voices to be heard, and like you said, to have full autonomy of our bodies, like the fact that that's a present day conversation.
And so this fight doesn't only apply to women in privileged, like from privileged backgrounds, in privileged positions. Right. It applies to all of us, right? Right. And when we talk about these women, and when we remember these women, what we remember is the strength in the mundane, right? Power in the mundane, and what an ordinary person can do.
Still talking about these women in 2025, and I think can look to examples of their work on how to navigate 2025 and beyond. Speaks to a lot
it's
about
a very
them.
Scary time.
But Christy, I want to, because I see we're running out of time, I want to say thank you so much, seriously, for not only helping me with a lot of the research on this project, but lending your voice to it and your perspectives, and like helping me with some of these episodes. Listeners, please be prepared to hear Christy on this podcast again. I'm going to have her on as much as she wants to do. But no, seriously, Christy, thank you so much. For doing this episode with me.
Well, thank you, Asia. I love being here. I love rambling, and I love talking. So I'm more than happy to be back if you ask me to. And it's been fun. I love this project. It was really eye-opening. I love little, snippets of information that I can project back out to the world and kind of immobilize in a way. So, well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for believing in me and my knowledge. I'm very flattered, actually, that you asked me, so.
Of course. All right. Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, listeners. Well, and thank y'all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this podcast today. Please be on the lookout for Coretta's episode that's coming next, and I will catch you guys next time.